You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 473 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, by the end of the last episode, the Federals' Red River campaign had pretty much completely run off the rails after the Battle of Mansfield on April 8, 1864, and the Battle of Pleasant Hill on the 9th.
Confederate General Richard Taylor's decision to give battle and stop the Yankees before they reached Shreveport had paid off handsomely, as the fighting at Mansfield had turned into a disaster for the Federals.
And then at Pleasant Hill, Taylor seemed on the verge of finishing the job he'd started the day before. But then a successful Federal counterattack sent the Confederates reeling and turned the tide of the battle. Nevertheless, when all was said and done, the Federal commander, Nathaniel Banks, issued orders for another retreat. And with that, Banks' march on Shreveport came to an ignominious end.
And so, at both Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, Dick Taylor's combativeness paid dividends for the rebels, while Nathaniel Banks' failings as a general had been on full display. In the end, Confederate aggression and Banks' incompetence doomed his effort to reach Shreveport.
However, as we reminded you guys at the end of the last episode, Banks' column was just one arm of the intended Federals' pincers movement aimed at Shreveport. The other part of the Federal pincer, the movement of Frederick Steele's force coming down into Louisiana from Arkansas, will be what we're going to talk about in this show.
In the spring of 1864, Major General Frederick Steele was 45 years old. A native New Yorker, he graduated 30th in the West Point class of 1843, 9 places behind his friend Ulysses S. Grant.
Steele was a lieutenant in the 2nd U.S. Infantry in Mexico and was breveted for gallantry. After the Mexican War, he served at various posts in California, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Kansas. The outbreak of the Civil War found Captain Steele at Fort Leavenworth in troubled Kansas.
He received a promotion to major and led a composite battalion of regulars at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri in August 1861. A month later, Steele, like many other regular officers, transferred to the volunteer service, where there were more opportunities for advancement. After serving as colonel of the 8th Iowa, he was promoted to brigadier general in January 1862.
He commanded the District of Southeast Missouri for several months until being transferred to Major General Samuel Curtis's Army of the Southwest. Steele commanded a division in Curtis's second invasion of Arkansas, assisting in the capture of Helena in July 1862.
During a brief stint as commander of the Army of the Southwest, beginning in September 1862, Steele reversed Curtis's policy of humane treatment for the thousands of contrabands who took refuge at Helena. He also turned a blind eye to the excesses of dishonest northern cotton brokers who flocked to the Mississippi River town.
Steele reported to Ulysses S. Grant's Army of Tennessee in December 1862 and took charge of another division. He served under William Tecumseh Sherman at Chickasaw Bluffs and Arkansas Post. In March 1863, he was promoted to Major General and proceeded to lead a division of 15th Corps through the Vicksburg campaign.
After Vicksburg's surrender, Steele returned to Helena at the end of July 1863 and assumed command of Union forces in Arkansas. In August, he set out with a 12,000-man force to capture the state capital of Little Rock. Despite stifling heat and humidity and rampant sickness in his ranks, Steele maneuvered the Confederates into abandoning Little Rock on September 10th.
Frederick Steele thought he knew more about campaigning in Arkansas than Ulysses S. Grant did. Central Arkansas had many of the same characteristics as northern Louisiana. It was hilly and forested, with most of the population scattered about the countryside, on farms, and in small towns and villages. In the spring, rains turned the few roads into ribbons of seemingly bottomless mud.
Steele had to contend with Confederate troops to the south and west, hostile Indians and lawless jayhawkers in the west, and rebel guerrillas operating as partisan rangers who roamed more or less freely throughout the countryside.
In addition, Steele was reluctant to participate in any venture with Nathaniel Banks, and he said so. But Grant forced him to cooperate, and Steele obeyed. His orders were clear-cut. He was to take a force and march from Arkansas down into northern Louisiana, working in concert with Banks and David Dixon Porter to capture Shreveport. How this was to be accomplished was left up to Steele.
Steele at first planned to march southwest from Little Rock and approach the Washita River somewhere between Hot Springs and El Dorado. From there, he would descend to Monroe, Louisiana, which was located on the Washita.
It was a straightforward approach that could be expected to be free of Confederate resistance until the force reached Louisiana. If Steele didn't cross the Washita River sooner, he would do so at Monroe and follow an uncompleted railroad line west in an almost straight line until he reached the Red River opposite Shreveport. If he crossed the Red north of Shreveport, he would be able to approach the town from the same side of the river. If he approached by way of the rail line, his artillery could harass the town while Banks attacked from the south.
For some reason, though, Steele decided to veer more to the southwest. He would assemble his force at Arkadelphia and then go on to Washington, the capital of Confederate Arkansas, about 70 miles north of Shreveport.
Unfortunately for Civil War generals, the invention and then the use of radio in warfare was still over 3 decades in the future. So here, once Frederick Steele up in Arkansas set his plan in motion, the difficulties and distances involved meant there would be little to no hope of timely communication occurring with either Banks or Porter down in Louisiana. So Steele would simply have to proceed, trusting in the timetable Nathaniel Banks had set for the campaign.
On March 17, 1864, Steele ordered Brigadier General John Thayer, the commander at Fort Smith in western Arkansas, to march his troops to Arkadelphia, where he would join with Steele's column coming from Little Rock. Steele gave Thayer until April 1st to march the 170 miles.
Steele then ordered the commander of the small garrison at Pine Bluff to send scouts to watch for any movement by Confederate forces to the south. Steele marched from Little Rock on March 23rd with the 3rd Division, 7th Corps, and 2 brigades of Union cavalry. His force totaled 6,800 men, and Thayer would add another 3,600, making a main column that would descend on Shreveport 10,400 men strong.
Steele's troops, who had been performing garrison duty, would need some time to adjust to the rigors of campaigning and only covered 9 miles the first day. The next day, they reached the Washita River at the tiny village of Rockport, which they found deserted.
Although the Federals easily forded the shallow river, they stopped to throw up a bridge in case spring rains made the water level rise. This construction project slowed them, and for the next 3 days, the column marched at a rather leisurely pace to a point a few miles outside Arkadelphia. So far, the Confederates seemed to be ignoring them.
On the Confederate side, Department Commander Edmund Kirby Smith's district commander in Arkansas was Major General Sterling Price. Price should be familiar to longtime podcast listeners from the fighting in Missouri early in the war and then the Battle of Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas in March 1862. In the summer of 1862, he fought 2 losing battles against William Rosecrans at Iuka and Corinth. In addition, Price suffered another defeat when he tangled with Benjamin Prentiss at Helena in July 1863.
Price had seen the Confederate-controlled territory in his district shrink drastically since the Federals had captured Little Rock, and the number of troops under his command was small, just 5 brigades of cavalry, although they were mostly tough veterans. They were concentrated in the southwest portion of Arkansas. Those brigades were widely separated when Steele began his expedition. 2 were east of the Saline River, one near Monticello and the other near Elba, and east of the Washita River, approximately halfway between the towns of Pine Bluff and Camden. Of the other 3, led by Brigadier General John Marmaduke, 2 were with Marmaduke at Camden, one under Brigadier General Joseph Shelby, the other under Colonel Colton Green, and the 3rd, Brigadier General W.L. Cables, was west of Washington on the Red River. Marmaduke's brigades totaled somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 men.
Marmaduke's intelligence gathering was suffering from a time lag. On March 25th, he dispatched his brigades to specific points, only to discover that Steele's column was already approaching Arkadelphia.
Marmaduke had intended to harass the Federal column from both front and rear, and then attack its supply wagons with a 3rd brigade from the flanks. However, when the rebel cavalry reached its objective at Tate's Bluff, they found only foot and hoof prints and wagon tracks. Having missed the Yankees, Marmaduke decided to make a dash for the Little Missouri River and contest the enemy's crossing of that stream with all 3 of his brigades.
When Steele reached Arkadelphia, he was expecting to link up with John Thayer, but upon reaching that place, there was no sign of Thayer. After waiting for 3 days and growing more worried each day, Steele finally felt he could wait no longer.
On April 1st, Steele marched out of Arkadelphia and headed toward Washington, some 43 miles away to the southwest as the crow flies. Cable's Confederate Cavalry Brigade began skirmishing with the Federals almost immediately. That night, Marmaduke ordered Green's brigade to take up a blocking position on the Washington Road near the Little Missouri River.
The next morning, Cable was ordered to join Green. Marmaduke was putting the pieces into place to carry out his plan to contest the Federals' crossing of the Little Missouri. But then word arrived that the enemy column had turned toward Elkins Ferry, bypassing the spot where Marmaduke was going to confront it.
Steele seized and then began fortifying the ferry crossing and placing artillery on all the approach roads. Shelby's brigade of rebel horsemen harassed the rear of the Federal column as the Yankees closed up on the river. On April 3rd and 4th, the Federals crossed the Little Missouri. Marmaduke, with 1,200 troopers of Green and Cable's brigades, attacked the enemy vanguard while the crossing was taking place, and sent several regiments of Federals tumbling back toward the river, where they rallied upon the main body of troops there, and Marmaduke was forced to withdraw.
Shelby joined the other 2 brigades that night, and Marmaduke pulled everyone back to Prairie du Anne, where the Confederates had built earthworks. On April 6th, Marmaduke received reinforcements from Indian Territory in the form of Brigadier General Richard Gano's brigade of Texas Cavalry.
Steele finally received news from Thayer, who was trying to find him as Thayer's column marched down from Hot Springs. Steele halted his column to give Thayer time to catch up. Steele's men were resting on April 8th and 9th while the battles of Mansfield and Pleasant Hill were being fought. But Steele, of course, knew nothing about what was happening far to the south in Louisiana with Nathaniel Banks and David Dixon Porter.
When Thayer arrived, Steele's men weren't impressed by their reinforcements. To Steele's men, Thayer's column was a motley collection of ragtag soldiers, including Indians, and seemed to have every variety of wagon known to man. But despite their many types of wheeled transportation, Thayer's men had no supplies.
Right. You see, Thayer apparently expected to resupply from Steele's column, but Steele's men had consumed most of their rations on the march and while waiting for Thayer. As a result of this logistics boondoggle, Steele was forced to send an empty wagon train back to Little Rock for supplies. The quartermasters were told to return as quickly as possible with a month's supply of half rations for 15,000 men from the stocks at the state capitol.
On April 10th, Steele moved forward across Prairie du Anne, pushing two of Marmaduke's brigades before him. However, by late afternoon, Confederate opposition stiffened as the rebels reached their earthworks on the western edge of the prairie, and the vigorous skirmishing the two sides had engaged in up to this point now turned into more serious fighting.
The engagement intensified until nightfall, when darkness brought an end to the fighting. The next day, the 11th, rather than assault the Confederate position, Steele tried to bluster his way to victory by putting on a grand display of assembling his line of battle in plain sight. But the rebels weren't impressed, and quite sensibly stayed put in their earthworks. So when all was said and done, the Federals simply returned to their camps of the previous night.
But that night, on the Confederate side, Sterling Price issued orders for a withdrawal. Marmaduke's cavalrymen were to fall back some 8 miles toward Washington, abandoning without a fight the earthworks which, up until that point, had held the Federals at bay.
Well, Price had made a blunder, but he was surprised by Steele's next move. Because after occupying the abandoned Confederate earthworks on the morning of April 12th, rather than pressing forward, the Federals marched off in the opposite direction, heading east on the road to Camden on the Washita River.
Sterling Price didn't know it, but his good fortune was due to the Federals' supply difficulties. You see, despite the Confederates abandoning their earthworks on the western edge of the prairie, Frederick Steele realized that until those new supplies arrived from Little Rock, he couldn't proceed with his march toward Shreveport.
In fact, the Federal supply situation threatened to become so desperate that Steele decided he had to withdraw in order to shorten the time it would take him to meet the all-important supply wagons as they rumbled south from Little Rock. Thus, the Federals marched eastward toward Camden on the Washita, where Steele planned to meet the supply wagons.
The Federals marched toward Camden on April 12th and 13th. On the 13th, the rear guard was attacked repeatedly by fresh Confederate reinforcements that Sterling Price had received from Indian Territory, including Colonel Tandy Walker's brigade of Choctaws.
The Confederates harassed the enemy rear guard, slowing down the Federals and allowing more rebels to close up so that a larger assault could be launched on Thayer's troops at the back of the Federal column. The Confederate attack was repulsed, but only after most of the rest of the Federals turned back to assist Thayer's hard-pressed troops.
The next day, the 14th, it wasn't the Confederates, but pouring rain that slowed down Steele. The Federals were forced to lay down a corduroy road before the wagons and artillery could pass through the soggy bottomlands.
That day, after an exhausting march, Steele received the unwelcome news from his scouts that a large enemy force was assembling between him and Camden. The news was correct, because on the Confederate side, Marmaduke had taken all three of his brigades and rode 60 miles around the Federal column to take up a blocking position across the road 14 miles from Camden. This was bad news indeed for Steele, but he believed he had enough men to simply bowl through the rebel blocking position and get to Camden, where he could dig in until his supplies arrived.
Down in Louisiana, 5 days earlier, after the Battle of Pleasant Hill, Kirby Smith had met with Dick Taylor at Mansfield to discuss the situation.
Although Smith and Taylor had butted heads before Dick Taylor decided to seize the bull by the horns and try to stop Banks before he reached Shreveport, Kirby Smith now said he supported Taylor's decision. Well, in any case, it would have been hard for Smith to do anything else now, considering Taylor's victories at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill.
But Kirby Smith said he didn't want Taylor to pursue Banks. Instead, he wanted Taylor to remain near Shreveport in case Frederick Steele managed to get past Sterling Price and Marmaduke up in Arkansas and threaten Shreveport from the north.
However, Dick Taylor had his mind set on pursuing Nathaniel Banks. Taylor insisted that with Banks' column having been turned back, Steele's force alone couldn't mount a serious threat to Shreveport. But Kirby Smith refused to change his mind. Banks may be out of the picture, but Smith said he still feared David Dixon Porter's Union gunboats might push upriver and attack Shreveport.
Kirby Smith stayed with Taylor at Mansfield until April 11th, then returned to Shreveport. Before leaving, he told Taylor to move his troops from Pleasant Hill back to Mansfield. But when Taylor simply ignored those orders, Smith returned to Mansfield on April 13th.
Kirby Smith struck a deal with his bull-headed subordinate. Dick Taylor said he'd be willing to take the bulk of his forces and join up with Sterling Price against Steele. Once Steele was either destroyed or forced to retreat, then Taylor would return to fight Banks with both his own and also Price's forces. Well, after Kirby Smith agreed to this plan, Taylor, on April 14th, moved 3 of his infantry divisions to Shreveport, those of Walker, Parsons, and Churchill's, now commanded by Tappan. Meanwhile, Polignac's small and battered division, along with the cavalry, was given orders to follow Banks.
Dick Taylor went to Shreveport ready to lead his 3 infantry divisions north, but instead received an unpleasant surprise when Kirby Smith told him that the latest news from Arkansas had Steele falling back toward Camden, and that he, that is Kirby Smith, not Taylor, was going to lead Taylor's troops north into Arkansas, join up with Sterling Price, and pursue and destroy Steele.
Kirby Smith told Dick Taylor he could either remain at Shreveport at headquarters or return to the field to harass Banks. Well, Taylor, practically incandescent with fury, rode south to do what he could to make trouble for Nathaniel Banks, while Kirby Smith marched out of Shreveport on April 16th, with visions dancing in his head of linking up with Sterling Price, defeating Steele, and marching into Little Rock as a hero.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Rugged and Sublime, The Civil War in Arkansas, edited by Mark Christ.
This is a collection of 5 essays, one for each year of the war, 1861 through 1865. Well, obviously, with Arkansas being Tracy's home state, we're predisposed to have a special interest in what happened there. But these essays are actually a good read for anyone who wants to sharpen the focus on this area and how the war played out in this part of the Trans-Mississippi. So there you go.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Joel B., Rory M., Susan J., Eric, Zoe G., and Jean W.
A big thank you to all of them. Thanks also to Spiritwood Music for permission to use their song Midnight on the Water as the music you hear at the start and at the end of every episode.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope you join us again next time when we see what happens in Arkansas with Steele's Federals desperately needing supplies while the Confederates close in on them. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.